Hello, everybody. Welcome to another mind walk in the garden. I don't yet have a topic in mind today. It's a relatively gray day, as the past few have been. There could be a little rain, but my predictive capacities suggest not so much. It's often foggy in my neighborhood. Sometimes there's mist. It's surprising how different the character, the deep feeling of the situation is in bright sunlight or gray cloudiness. And it can change very quickly from one to the other. Our minds are somewhat like this. I suppose most of us are easily captivated by or repulsed by strong stimuli. We live in a world of mechanical noises and extremely penetrating forms of light and electromagnetic radiation that never existed on Earth until we began building the machines that emit them. And there were other things that never existed too, like cages, or even religions. There must have been a time in the developmental history of our species where there were no formal languages, too. And strangely, or perhaps intriguingly, there's this idea of roots in language, small particles that themselves have meaning and get woven into words. And while I think this idea is useful and interesting, there are alternative perspectives where what we can see in some ancient languages, if we look at them as they develop over time, or even if we look at them in state, so to speak, in how they are now, where it appears that whole sentences or longer forms of language became words, became single words. And this contradicts some of the theory of roots. Though I think the reality is much more complicated. Or let's say this, it has diverse aspects, not one or two. Earlier I was thinking about, I think about language a lot, and I was thinking about, I don't just think about language, I'm some kind of linguistic archaeologist, detective, poet, writer, philosopher, yet I'd reject all those labels because none of them really capture these fascinations and their origins in my concern. Might be a little bit of wind noise here, but it probably won't last a long time. Of course, the wind of me making face noises will last a little while. But I was thinking earlier, as I often do, about words. And one of the astonishing features of words that's overlooked, and it relates with our own interiority and consciousness, is that definitions are public. We all mostly know what kind of thing the word tree refers to, or if we're perhaps a little more aware, what kind of being, or if we're even slightly more aware, what kind of instance of the universe or time-space that the word tree refers to. We all understand mostly the definition. But the connotations and associations of words are partly private and partly emerge from clade relations, from shared concerns and imperatives in human cohorts, both local to some particular place, conversation, get-together, and also distributed in clades who share purposes and concerns and perspectives. But everyone's connotation web for any word will almost always have unique elements, or elements whose connection with the definition is unclear because it doesn't come from logic, rationality, or even linguistics. It comes from personal experience. For example, if a fallen log saved my uncle, who was trapped in the rapids of a river and in danger of drowning, and I know this, then tree or log will have a very different connotation for me than if, for example, I'm a woodcutter, a logger, in which case log, though both people will have the same definition, right? They'll have very different connotations. So you can see how, in this example, our purposes and the way we are in the world in a given moment or situation, or an ongoing moment or situation, radically transforms our sense of what it is a word points toward. Now, this is the really interesting thing, that words are like pointers. And they don't merely point, because when we use words, our imagination is involved. And so, in a way, language could be understood as a way to collapse the manifold of dreaming, imagination, and relation into deliverables, tokens, and the tokens point, if we're using them that way. Of course, there are other ways to use them. In song, tokens can be evocative rather than declarative. I had to pause there a moment to try to understand the communication of one of my animal companions. It's easy to become confused. Sometimes we have to pause and slow down in our thinking and habits in order to understand what another being may be trying to communicate to us or with us about. And if we have a habitual way of relating, it's easy to overlook the subtle signals or even the overt signals of another communications partner. Who, without language, may be trying to encourage us to pay attention to something that we've overlooked because of our habitual way of being in the relationship or a situation. As humans, we have a peculiar situation. Now, I think it's common, in a way, to all social animals. But with humans, because we have the overlay of representational cognition, and now, in our time, we have representational devices, objects and machines and clothing and such, cars and houses and so on, pictures, books. But there's a deep conflict for many of us, and some of us are able to turn this to our advantage, and for others it's a catastrophically crippling situation. But there's a deep division, a polarization between the public and the private, the secular and the cloistered, one might say. And so we often wander around thinking very strange thoughts, kind of disembodied thoughts, about what others might think, or what others might expect, or what we are supposed to do, how things are supposed to be. The difference between the world we live in and the one that we imagine as just and good and true, the idealization of the world, or various idealizations. It's a good thing I paused. There's something unusual going on. I'm struggling to understand it. I may not succeed today. It may take more time. Sometimes to learn we have to see a situation from a new angle that our habits might incline us to overlook. animal friend was trying to get me to pay attention. I think he was aware that I was distracted. He's a good companion and a brilliant teacher. He's very kind and patient. He teaches me things that don't fit in language. Things that we can only really learn in intimate relation and mutual concern. For this, I'm deeply grateful. So we have this chasm in us. And as I said, some are able to turn this to their clear advantage largely in various ways, some authentic, some predatory, some opportunistic, some cruel. But it's a very important aspect of our experience of consciousness and awareness. Our waking mind is easily captured by anything that appears as a threat or opportunity in our thought. And the funny thing about this is that often, when our consciousness is thus captured, our subtler senses that we need in order to understand, for example, whether what we're reacting to is largely a figment or projection in our mind or psyche, or of our psyche, or whether there's really something matching it in the world of our experience that is worth paying attention to. And so many people that I know are essentially held hostage by the historically established routes in thought and consciousness, awareness and concern that have become a bit like roads or freeways, right? They're no longer natural, they're paved over. They're the routes we always take if we're driving a car. Of course, we cannot take that route, or, it's much stranger and perhaps dangerous to take that route on foot. And there are many things that are fascinating here, but one of them that I want to talk about briefly anyway is that our awareness emulates the technologies it's exposed to. Our minds are transformed by the particular and peculiar characteristics of all of the technologies that we encounter or use, but perhaps more than any other these days, the computer, and in which I include smartphones and televisions and pads and so on. So that, in the beginning, the operating systems were, and the computers themselves were analogies of mental activity. But as with most of our technologies, they quickly became, that relationship flipped over, and they became the arbiters of the style of our cognition. That is, they imprinted their functions and characteristics on not just our thought and awareness and consciousness, but also on our bodies. And we can expect this to continue to go on for as long as there are modern civilizations like those we are presently subject to. When I think about these topics, I think about consciousness and awareness and language and technologies and so on, I like to imagine historical developments over time, because it looks to me like our species has been traveling on something like a ladder that leads both downward, I'll decide this is downward, away from deep awareness and relation into abstraction, and upward into insight and developmental what's the right word? Well, something that can appear as progress. The problem is that most of the forms of behavior and development that we associate with progress today are deeply technologically envisioned. And it's very easy for us humans to find ourselves in a situation where what we call progress is actually regress. So it's very clear that technological progress has largely represented relational and other kinds of regress. So that a powerful irony is introduced. Most progress isn't. Or rather, what appears to be progress in 1 or 2 or 10 domains can be regress in 50 or 100 or 1,000 domains. And since we're only looking at the 10 that appear to advance, we miss the 50 that become, inhibited or retarded as technologies are established and popularized and become dominant. Earlier I was thinking about whether or not, or in what ways, our senses are alone. So surely you can understand that without a mind, the sense of touch, feeling something, would have no content. There would be stimuli, but no being experiencing it. And this is part of the situation with machines. The situation with our machines today is quite complex, but effectively there's no being inside there feeling anything. And this problem is often bandied about in philosophical circles. But that's not really my intention here. I want to say something simpler. Right now I am speaking, and so my imagination is engaged, and it's engaged in a very peculiar way if we think carefully about it, if we follow it carefully, because I actually have no idea what I'm about to say next. And what is the faculty with which I determine what I will say and how I will say it, the tone the music, or the lack thereof. So there's a faculty that's assembling my utterances, or I am assembling my utterances with this faculty, and I know nearly nothing of it. I have no real idea what it is or how it works. And although we can make models of this, and we can even instantiate these models in machines, it's not the same thing at all. Because I'm not a model, right? I'm not a machine. So what I was thinking about was a couple of things, and one of them is there's a super sense, the super sense of me, or my soul, or my interiority, without which the other senses don't work. Right? There's a purposive feeling, being, inside this body or associated with this body, wandering through this place. And that's the thing that alerted me that something was unusual with my animal companion. Although my animal companion was very demonstrative. It basically made some gestures that very clearly called me out of my distraction, just as if someone were tapping me on the shoulder and saying, wake up, pay attention. There's something to see here. I need your attention right now. And so at first I stopped speaking, but then I paused the recording so that I could really pay attention. And something quite surprising took place, which I'll have to learn more about in coming days. I depend on living beings and places and the sky and history and the future to orient my sensing and awareness and concern. In fact, in my thought, it's not always this way in my experience, but in my thought, the entire living world is like, well, again, we can have the public and private ideas, right? The public idea could be that the living world, all the beings in it, every single organism is an extension of my own body, my own being, my own mind. And so really, all of these organisms are me. But we can invert that too. And I think this is the more likely, this inversion more likely has precedence or prevalence, which is that I am an embodiment of all of their bodies and histories and lineages and concerns and dreams and struggles and triumphs and catastrophes, hopes. And so as I walk in this garden, I walk for all beings in all of time. I am for them. And most of the senses that we need that are truly important to our humanity are obliterated by the relatively crude, sometimes mechanical, and often clumsy structured habits and pursuits of my waking consciousness. And one of the most important faculties we have is one that gets a lot of weird airplay and then is also dismissed by much of the thought we would think, we would call rational. And that's the sense of the future. And we can sense the future, but the faculties we do it with are subtle. And they're easily compromised or occluded by, again, the rather clumsy and often tediously linguistic or boorish character of our habits in waking consciousness. What we are inclined to pay attention to because historically that's how we rolled. Or that's how we learned to proceed. And I'm sure I often sound like I'm, denigrating the waking mind. It's not my intention to do so. I think in its essence, there's something brilliant and beautiful about it. But in order for it to be habitable and rich and humane, in order for us to actually grow and make progress we can trust instead of the label of progress that often hides something terrible, it has to be encompassed and balanced by faculties we have no name for. The integrative faculties that allow our senses to make sense of stimuli. A friend of mine posted an article this morning about an ancient African tribe she spent time with. And the article, first of all, she posted some things from her own experience and thought, and then associated the article with these feelings and thoughts. What she was talking about was something quite important. This idea of synesthesia. To feel sounds, to hear colors, to smell shapes and textures, sense mixing. And I think this is really important and beautiful and profound, because in fact, if you think carefully about it, without the capacity to feel what green is like, green is kind of empty and meaningless. And I've known people who were sensory synesthetes, but the more radical position is that we are all sensory synesthetes. It's just that something in our development or situation, or the strange conflict between the public and the private, this innate synesthesia has been lost for most of us and is preserved in a relatively modest cohort of people. And I think this is really, really important, because in dreaming, well, not just because, but in dreaming, all experience has a synesthetic quality that isn't as simply described as I felt the sound, because in dreaming, it's not even clear what senses are. They're not our ordinary senses at all. There's something quite astonishing going on when we dream that's unlike our models and expectations. Of course, here we run into the problem of supposed to's. When we're children, essentially, we're told you're not supposed to smell green, right? You're not supposed to hear circles. And we have a strange intruder in modern consciousness that's a bit demonic in the sense of declaring to us what the appropriate forms of sensing and relation are, must be, should be, which ones indicate illness or damage or what is perceived or projected as dangerous diversion, dangerous diversity. And so we have this idea of hallucination. Now, the idea is useful and we shouldn't throw it away. It's certainly plausible and possible, and some of us have experienced it, that we may hallucinate in certain situations of extreme stress or ecstasy, danger, illness, or creativity. Yeah. Because how is the music composed? It's half dreamt and half assembled and half something else I can't say. And it's the same with writing or poetry or even speaking, to a more limited degree, depending on how we're speaking and why we're speaking, and to whom we speak, to whom we imagine we speak. Because who truly knows who they're speaking to? We have to imagine it. And so in a way, we are hallucinating listeners, communication partners, lovers. When two people meet and there's romantic interest, trust me when I tell you their imagination is deeply involved in all kinds of different ways. But what I wanted to point out is that there's an encompassing supersense, and it's not like any of our senses, and it certainly isn't mere hallucination. We can tell whether we like the food or not. And that's a complex constellation of stimuli and circumstance and so on, who we're with, where we are, our history, what happened a minute ago, what happened yesterday, what happened 10 years ago, what we imagine might happen in the future. All these things are included somehow. But they're none of them sufficient to explain or describe the supersense with which our experience, in which our experience is integrated and becomes meaningful or meaningless, confusing or inspiring. But we should all be free to discover what it means to be human together. And discovering what it means to be subject to machines together is a curse. It's not only a curse. Someone who can preserve some of our essential interiority can play detective in the midst of the curse. and get a glimpse of what's actually going on underneath all of that. Or maybe a series of glimpses that over time become meaningful, as perhaps some of mine have. We're not merely humans, though, I'll tell you this much. Whatever it is we may be, the common ideas that surround and inform our humanity are both woefully incomplete and cripplingly domineering. The post my friend made and the article she associated with it about synesthesia rang a bell with me in a deep way. Because in states of trance or ecstasy, and sometimes in states of intoxication, the natural synesthesia that I suspect may be fundamental to our experience of being is available to us in at least some limited way. And many people have viewed some indigenous art. An example might be the paintings of the Huichol people or the indigenous Australians. They look at these paintings and they think, oh, they're doing psychedelics. It's really unfortunate, this idea. And it's not that they never did, or they're not doing psychedelics or something like that. But rather, there are very simple ways of inducing trance in humans. But we have to learn them, some of them. Some of them are built into us, in a way. Well, that's the wrong language, but some of them are innate in us. And these ancient peoples had common everyday unintoxicated experience of profound synesthesia, where, for example, they could not merely see the strands of essence connecting all beings, they could feel them and perhaps even travel on them. And these arts have mostly been lost to us, though there are some strange remnants. And one of the reasons why I'm very cautious about the topic of psychedelics, and I have complex feelings and ideas about it, is because it's easy for us to find something where we can just flip the switch and now we're having an experience that we don't usually have. And that's dangerous for lots of reasons. That can actually further inhibit the faculties that we're seeking in taking such a risk. Because then those faculties become associated with the drug and we think, oh, it's the drug that did this. When actually it's not so much like that. It's more complex. It's an intimacy, a symbiotic experience of being together with the plant, its spirit, its history, its nature, and our interiority and history and nature, our minds. And of course, all things transform our minds when we take them in. Water transforms our mind. Foods transform our mind. Right? It's just that some drugs do this very dramatically, very powerfully, and fairly quickly in some cases. In the image in my friend's post, an indigenous woman was photographed while in the clapping trance. A synesthetic mode of awareness that is catalyzed by clapping in certain rhythms. Drums and rattles and high-pitched sounds have all long been used to catalyze group trance, which is a really profound thing that I think we're missing out on a lot, and individual trance states in which we can seek to learn and see in ways that our ordinary waking mind is not only incapable of, it may be formally opposed to. And this is in part why some people under the influence of certain intoxicants experience paranoia. Because, well, this is an aspect of that issue. It's not the explanation. It's an ingredient, but the waking mind forms a structured mannequin in a way, right? A kind of a ersatz self, and it's extremely, once this is formed, it becomes profoundly interested in preserving its dominance, and maybe even preserving it eternally. Right? Some people want to live forever, but what really wants to live forever is the kind of the mannequin, right? The doll of them. Ego is often used as a word to point at this aspect of our humanity. And it isn't that we want to get rid of it, but we might like to be able to take the costume off. And this is the important thing here. Right? This is the liberty I ache for myself and all people, is that it's okay if we want to wear the costume of the mannequin, but it's a terrible trap if we can't take it off or tell the difference between that and ourselves, right? Or that and our essence, that and our true nature. Between that and the original light, we are the embodiment and moment of being of. In truth, I adore and have great reverence for the living world and all of its beings. Even those people who don't like me. Even those people who want to hurt me. And there are a few. And they probably think I don't know what they're up to, but I can tell what they're up to and why they're up to it. At least in the near at hand scope, right? Or someone who has decided they're my enemy embarks on a mission to cause me harm. And thankfully there aren't too many such people, but there are a few. Some of them are quite skillful. Some of them pay very close attention. But I love them. And I don't wish them harm. I suppose I'm capable of war and combat and things like this. But they're not my preferred modes of relation. And once one becomes concerned with war and adversaries and adversarial processes, now we're kind of in a trap, again, another kind of trap where our threat sentinel aspect of awareness that watches for threats and represents them in consciousness. This thing can become, it's the kind of thing where if you give it too much sugar, it quickly becomes most of what's going on. Give it a little sugar, it wants more. Give it more, it wants 5 times more. Give it that, it wants 50 times more. Pretty soon, really in trouble in our minds. But I adore the living beings, all of the living beings of Earth, and the sky, and even the beings the intelligences who exist without needing to be locally embodied. There are many interesting opportunities in being that are nothing like our ideas. Yeah. They're vastly stranger. There are intelligences who participate in all embodied form, all embodied beings. There are intelligences that can travel from body to body, from place to place, time to time, situation to situation. They're not bound by time, and they're not bound by form. And perhaps we are such intelligences, but we have forgotten this. The structured rationality of language and public thinking can easily overwhelm the subtle senses that would otherwise effloresce and develop. And that would be progress. That to me seems like trustworthy progress. But I'd like us to be able to take off the costume of self. And this is something I've pursued and I'm very interested in understanding more about. And we might need a little help, you know? In a living place or a tree or a lake or a river or the mountain, the clouds, the sun, the moon, the morning star, the companion star, the Dipper stars, the Pleiades stars, the Thunderbird constellation, which you won't find in any book. The flower, the bee, the dragonfly, the goose, owl. All of these beings, they can help us if we're oriented in reverence and respect, in love and mutual concern. But yeah, this costume of Darren, it's quite troubling, and I'm sure I'd be happier without it. I was thinking earlier, I often think about dreaming. I was thinking that maybe our waking life is like the dreaming of our soul prior to its embodiment or beyond its embodiment. And then our dreaming life is a return to intimacy with that not yet fully embodied and structured potential, that energy, that synthesizing flow. And I don't know what death is. And like most embodied beings, I fear it. And yet, I suspect there's something very familiar about all of that. Something we've been through a million times before and may be experiencing thousands of times per second without being aware of it. It's not so bad. But I like being embodied. Maybe that's my problem. Not a big fan of the costume, though. I mean, it has beautiful aspects and features, but again, if we can't take it off, there's no way to tell what's good, what's desirable or undesirable. And of course, one could say, well, let go of desire altogether. Find your way. Become your way, free of desire and revulsion. And there's something to that too. But the words don't generate the experience. And the strange thing about our waking mind is that structured ideas and habits over time collapse our sensitivity into a costume that, were we free of it, we would never voluntarily put on, especially if we knew that once we put it on, we will see and act and live and think and feel as if the costume were ourselves, and we will try to protect it at all costs, often at terrible costs. And few of us would sign up for that experiment. Yet perhaps somehow each of us did. Most of being in relation is invisible to thought and our senses. And it's only if we can be freed from the costume and the habits and the structured freeways and metropolises of consciousness as we inherited it and as we were imprinted with its imperatives in our youth and throughout our lives. Only when we are free of that can we understand directly, right? Now all sensing becomes super sensing, and it's implicitly trustworthy. But this is a rare achievement for human beings, with the exception perhaps of young infants who are very close to this state, if not already, attempting to convince the adults of its importance, but they don't have language yet, so the adults don't know what to make of it. And they think, oh, that's very cute. Meanwhile, the child's gentle gesture with its outstretched hand is an invitation to another universe, and it wants to bring its parents home to the place of original light that is shining in the gaze of the infant and occluded in the gaze of the adult, however deeply that gaze may hint at what is hidden underneath. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning and growing and exploring together again very soon. Bye-bye for now.